everybody, it's Lisa and welcome back to my channel. So I am very excited to be filming this video today. Just like a couple hours before this, I was filming my most disappointing books of 2019 video, and it was really negative and it just kind of put me in like a sad mood. So I'm very excited to be filming this video because this is my favorite books of 2019 video. So I'm very excited to just kind of gush about some books that I absolutely loved this year. I tried to narrow it down quite a bit because I had a lot of books on this list, which was a good thing. I'm happy that I wanted to put so many books on this list, but I tried to narrow it down. So I think I have 8 books to talk to you about today, and I'm really excited to talk about it. So let's just get into it because I have a feeling I'm going to end up going on some tangents and some rants talking about how much I love these books. So I'm just going to get right into it with the first book. Also, I did try to order them a little bit by like my least most favorite and my most favorite. Just know that these are my favorite books of the year. So once we get into like the top like 3 or 4 books, they're all pretty equal because I loved them all, but I did try to order them a little bit. So the first book that I wanted to mention is Iggy Karela by Ashley Poston. I'm a little surprised that this kind of made the final cut, but when I think about this book, it just brings me so much joy and it just makes me feel really happy. So I wanted to mention it. So Iggy Karela is a Cinderella retelling, as you could imagine, and it follows a girl who is obsessed with, what is it called? Starfield. And it's sort of like a similar like Star Trek, Star Wars sort of thing. And she is like obsessed with it. And there is a convention that her dad actually created every year. And that's kind of where like the Cinderella like ball takes place at the convention. There's going to be a reboot for the series, but the guy who is cast to play the main character of this new adaptation for this thing that she loves, her and him kind of end up like sparking up a little bit of a romance, but they don't know who each other is. It's so cheesy and cute, and I just love it. I think I'm just a sucker for a good retelling. I just thought that this was really cute. I read this right after I finished It by Stephen King, so it was like the perfect, like cute, fluffy read to read something after It, which was a lot, but I absolutely loved it. I definitely want to reread it at some point because I just thought it was so cute. I know that there is like a sequel to this that's kind of like a companion novel, which I have not read. I think it's called The Princess and the Fangirl, so definitely need to read that because clearly I'm just into the cheesy romance retellings, so what's new? Definitely if you're just kind of in the mood for a cute retelling, that you kind of have to just, it's kind of like a mindless, but it's so enjoyable, and obviously like you know the story because you know the Cinderella story. At least I imagine you would know a Cinderella story by now, but it's just so cute and so fun. So definitely would recommend this one, and I had to mention it because I just loved it. So the next book that I have to mention is actually a nonfiction book, which I feel like when I was looking at this list, there is a bit of variety. I was expecting everything to be like a YA fantasy, but there is some variety, and this is a nonfiction book called Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered by Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. So Karen and Georgia are the hosts of the My Favorite Murder podcast, and I absolutely love that podcast. I am not really the biggest podcast listener, but that was kind of the first one that kind of got me into it, and I think it's such a good podcast. They talk about different murders and like true crime and things like that, but in a respectful but also funny way. And this nonfiction book is actually kind of more about them than murder. They're kind of just telling stories from their life and like how they got to the point of where they were when they created the podcast, and I absolutely loved it. So I actually ended up listening to the audiobook for this. I don't know if there's like pictures or certain visuals in the physical copy, so I definitely want to pick it up at some point, but the audiobook was a great decision because it's narrated by Karen and Georgia. So it honestly just felt like I was listening to a podcast episode that was more about themselves. One of my favorite things about the podcast is they have live shows. They go on tour and they do live shows in front of a live audience, and they record them and then put them as a podcast episode. And one of my favorite things about the audiobook was certain chapters or certain parts of chapters, they actually read aloud at a live show and recorded it and put that footage into the audiobook. So it wasn't just them reading the audiobook the whole time. There was actually a point where they were reading it out at a live show. And I absolutely loved that because the live show episodes of the podcast are some of my favorite podcast episodes of theirs. So to have that in the audiobook, I just thought was so cool and such a great idea. But I really enjoyed learning more about them, and I just thought it was so good. I think if you are a fan of the My Favorite Murder podcast and you haven't listened to the audiobook or read this book at all, I would definitely recommend. I don't know how much you would enjoy it if you don't listen to the podcast, because it isn't talking about necessarily the podcast that much. It's more about themselves, but there are a lot of jokes from the podcast, and the book is kind of split up in sections, and the sections are kind of things that are jokes from the podcast. So I don't know how much you would enjoy if you don't listen to the podcast, but if you do, I would highly recommend if you haven't read this already. So the next book that's actually a graphic novel that I want to mention is the Entire Saga series by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. I'm just mentioning the whole series because I started this graphic novel series this year and got caught up. I know currently they're kind of on a hiatus and they're going to be continuing it eventually, but I don't know when. So I got caught up this year, read all 9 volumes, I believe, and I absolutely loved them. So this is like a sci-fi graphic novel series where there are 2 warring planets, and people from both planets end up meeting under certain circumstances, and they end up falling in love and having a child, and it just kind of follows them because of who they are. They're trying to escape from people, and it's just kind of following them, trying to keep their family together and trying to survive, trying not to run into enemies, but also running into some, helpful people along the way. And it's so good. It definitely is a more adult and mature graphic novel series. There is definitely some sexual content and swearing and graphic violence and all of that fun stuff, but it's really good. I'm still recovering from where the last volume ended. And because, of course, they took a hiatus, we're going to be patiently waiting until they release the next volume. But I just really, really enjoyed it. I sometimes feel like with graphic novels, I don't connect with characters that easily because it's something that you read so quickly. I find that I don't always connect with the world or the characters as I would with a 300-page book. But I actually really connected with these characters. I really started to get invested in their lives. It was funny because there were characters that I didn't necessarily enjoy. I didn't like them, but I still cared about them when things happened to them. Because one thing about the series is they are not scared to kill people off. So just be aware, people are gonna die. It's a thing that happens. And I was shocked every single time a character died. And there were characters that obviously I cared about that ended up dying. That I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna sob now. But there were characters that I didn't think that I liked, and then they would die, and then I would start crying. So I think that they just did such a good job of investing you in a story, and I just really, really enjoyed it. I think it was so, so good. I can't wait for them to continue on. I don't know if there's any news on when they're gonna be releasing more volumes, but I know that they kind of made it to the halfway point in the series, and then they have another 9 volumes or something planned out. So I'm very excited for it to continue, but I really enjoyed the volumes that are out so far that I read this year, and I really, really can't wait to read some more. So the next book I have to mention is a classic, which who would have thought that would have been on this list? Not me. But I actually ended up reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen earlier this year, and I loved it. So I actually read this for the Reading Rush Readathon. So if you want to watch that vlog, I mean, go for it, but it's 45 minutes of me being uncomfortable talking to a camera because it was the first time I ever vlogged, and my channel was all still very new. So if you want to watch it, go for it, but you don't have to. But I read this for the Reading Rush, and I was really excited to read it because I know that this is a very beloved book. A lot of people really liked this book, and I had an interest in it because it was a classic that I actually thought that I might enjoy the story. So I was really excited to pick it up, and I absolutely loved it. I was kind of surprised that I liked it as much as I did. I thought I would maybe enjoy it, but I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed it. Also, this edition of Pride and Prejudice is beautiful. I think this is the Barnes & Noble edition, but it's the paperback version. So I might end up getting the hardcover version of this someday because I just feel like this is it's kind of flimsy, and it's a weird sort of paperback. I don't know how to describe it. It is really beautiful, and I want to read more of Jane Austen's books. That's something that I think I want to try and do in the new year. But yeah, I really liked it. I was surprised, and I'm surprised that it made it onto this list. and made it as high up into the list as it did, but I really liked it. So yeah, I would definitely recommend if you have an interest in this at all, because I was interested in it, but I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. So yeah, I really loved this, would really recommend, and yeah, definitely would also recommend the 2005 movie. I really enjoyed that as well. I feel like I don't really need to talk about what this is about. I feel like we all know at this point, but yes, definitely enjoyed it and very happy to have read this year. And I definitely want to collect like more versions of this, because there are some beautiful covers for Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen books in general. So I need to get some more pretty copies, because now I'm like, okay, I loved it. Now I want 100 copies. Okay. Now we are into top 4 territory. I feel like this is kind of when the list could very well get a little wishy-washy, just because I love all of these books so much. I definitely think my number 1 favorite book is my number 1 favorite book of the year, but these next 3 I definitely feel like are kind of interchangeable. So let's start with the first one, and that is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I feel like this book could either be in a lot of people's favorite books of the year videos or least favorite books of the year videos. I feel like a lot of people have very different opinions on this book, but I really liked it. I thought that the format, the story, everything was super interesting. I definitely don't think I connected with the characters as much as I did with Evelyn Hugo, also by Taylor Jenkins Reid, but I still really enjoyed it, and I thought that the format was really interesting. So this book basically follows a band that was really, really popular in the 70s, and they're being interviewed years later because they were super, super popular, and then they all of a sudden just ended. And no one really knows the full story as to how, you know, they got to that point where they were super, super popular, and then why they decided to break up when they did. So it was really interesting to kind of learn that story, but through an interview with everybody kind of involved. You know, people from the band, people who knew the band, people who worked with the band, family members. It was such an interesting way to kind of consume the story, because there were moments where they were retelling the same moment, but there was one story from somebody and then another story from another person. They were kind of saying different things, and you kind of had to pick and choose who was more reliable and who might be telling the truth. This is also one of those books that, because of that reason, also the things that were revealed at the end of the book, it's one of those books that when you reread it, it totally changes how you view the story. I actually haven't reread it yet, but I definitely want to give it a reread, and I want to read or listen to the audiobook, because I read this physically. So I feel like I have a very unpopular experience with this book, where I only read the physical copy, and I loved it. I feel like people who read it physically didn't like it as much as people with the audiobook, but I don't know, I'm strange. I don't know what to tell you. I definitely want to listen to the audiobook because it has a full cast for all of the characters, because there's a lot of characters in this story. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting to be in the perspective of a band, because I really like music, and I think that was kind of a cool perspective to be in. But yeah, definitely would recommend this if it sounds interesting to you. I know people have had quite various opinions on it, but I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to listen to the audiobook because I've heard it's great, and I definitely want to give this a reread. Next book I have to talk about might not be a surprise, because I vlogged my experience reading this book and I fell in love with it, and that is Capturing the Devil by Carrie Maniscalco. So this is the 4th book in the Stalking Jack the Ripper series, and it's also the final book. So I don't want to say too much about what actually happens in this book, because it is the 4th in a series, but in this series, we follow a girl named Audrey Rose and a boy, Thomas Creswell, and they are kind of this crime-solving, fighting duo. They also are the people who kind of inspect bodies after they've died, or after they've been killed, and that's how they kind of get involved in the first book, the Jack the Ripper murders. And it's just so good. It's such a good series. It's so interesting to see, the crime part of it and the murder part of it, which sounds messed up that I'm like, it's interesting, but I think you know what I mean. But also the romance between Audrey Rose and Thomas Creswell is just, it's so good. Chef's kiss. It's so good. Probably one of the reasons why I love these books so much. I feel like for some people, they may not like them because of how romance heavy it is, but I happen to love it because I love Audrey Rose and Thomas Creswell. I love them as a couple. I love them individually. So just them in general just makes me happy to read about. So I just will read anything that has to do with them. I definitely will say that this book and the 3rd book in the series, Escaping from Houdini, are a bit more romance heavy than the first 2. So I think maybe you might like the first 2 more if you are more interested in the murder mystery sort of aspect. But I feel like if you are reading the series and you read more than the first one and you want to keep going, you'll fall in love with Audrey Rose and Thomas Creswell and their relationship anyway, and I loved seeing their relationship. Like, this book was definitely romance heavy. I honestly at some points like forgot that we were supposed to be like solving a murder and that there was murders going on and there was a whole thing. But when that was introduced, it was really interesting to read about. But at the same time, I was so invested in these characters that I didn't mind reading about them and their struggles and trying to kind of wrap everything up in this final book. So I don't know, I just thought that this was the perfect conclusion. The way all the relationships and everything with the characters wrapped up and the way all of the murders and everything wrapped up, I just thought it was so well done. I think this was the perfect way to end the series. I think if she had continued writing them, I feel like it would have gotten to a point where it's like, okay, like we know what's coming, and it would have maybe gotten a little bit repetitive, but I feel like this was the perfect spot to end. Even though I would love to get more from Audrey Rose and Thomas Creswell, but I think it was a perfect place to end it, and I'm so happy I read the series. I also think that this series is like, all of a sudden, I feel like everybody's talking about it. I watch a lot of BookTube, and all of a sudden, I feel like there is a rise in the discussions about these books. So I'm really happy that people are actually starting to pick them up and read them because they're so good. They deserve more attention and hype and love, and I will forever love this series. Definitely one of my favorite series I've ever read. So definitely had to mention this final book in the series in this video. So the next book, which is like a close second favorite of the year, is Supernova by Marissa Meyer. Again, I vlogged my experience with reading this book too, so I think if you watched that vlog, this may not come as a surprise, but I loved Supernova. This is the third book in the Renegades trilogy, and again, not going to say too much about what happens in this book specifically because it is the final book in the series, but basically in this world we follow superheroes and villains. So we have the Renegades, who are the superheroes, and the Anarchists, who are the villains. So Nova was really young when the first war between the Renegades and the Anarchists happened, and she actually grew up with the Anarchists. So when she is older, she's like a teenager, she has an alias called Nightmare, and she is part of the Anarchists, but nobody knows Nightmare's real identity, so nobody knows that Nova is Nightmare. So she uses that to her advantage to try out to become a renegade, to get into their headquarters and to spy on them and get information to take back to the Anarchists. And that's all I'm going to say. I feel like that's all you need to know. And reading this series made me realize how much I love in books when characters kind of have to go undercover and pretend to be somebody else and like hide out and lay low and get information. That's like something that I just love. This is the final book in that trilogy, and just the conclusion, the way everything wrapped up, it was just so good. Definitely was not what I was expecting, but in a good way. I was really, really happy with how everything worked out and how everything came together. There were a lot of moments where I was crying, a lot of moments where I was happy, a lot of moments where I was really surprised. The whole epilogue to this book was one big surprise, and I definitely still would love to know more about it. If we got more from this world after that epilogue, I wouldn't be mad about it, but I do think that this was a great conclusion, even if we don't get more. I just had to clear some space up on my memory card, and now I don't remember what I was saying. But I'm just gonna continue anyway. So I think I was talking about how well of a conclusion this was. I feel like every question and every like plot line was sort of wrapped up. We got an answer for everything, and things that were kind of happening throughout the entire trilogy finally happened in this book and came together. There were a lot of reveals in this book because obviously Nova kind of has her secret identity where she is an anarchist, but nobody knows, and there's some other secret identities and all of that, and I think the reveals and everything in this book were just so good. I also think that this series is just really interesting because of the whole superhero and supervillain discussion, because no side is completely one way or the other. Like, the Renegades are not completely 110% good. There are good and bad Renegades, just like there are good and bad anarchists, and I think that that is kind of an interesting thing to see because you kind of find yourself siding with the bad characters, but also seeing the points of the good characters. And I just think that it's really, really interesting. And I feel like it's interesting because Nova is sort of in the middle where she is an anarchist and she has made some questionable decisions, but she's also not an evil person. But yeah, I just think that that is so interesting. And I really love this trilogy. Cannot recommend it enough. It's just super fun, as most Marissa Meyer books are. You know, it's a great world, there's great characters, there's great dialogue and banter and just everything, the romance, so much of it is so good. Marissa Meyer is just an incredible writer, and anytime she releases a book, I'm sure it'll be on a favorites video. So expect this for the near future. But yeah, definitely loved this and had to mention it. like my second favorite book of the year. So that's a big statement. So now we have made it to my favorite book of the year. I feel like this was a lot of people's favorite book last year, but I read it for the first time earlier this year in January, so it's my favorite book of this year. And that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this is a book that has been talked about quite a bit online. I feel like I'm mentioning this and everyone's going to be like, that's your favorite? Like, I thought we did this all last year, because so many people had this as their #1 favorite book of the year last year, or at least it was in their favorites video. But because of those videos, I actually ended up picking it up at the beginning of this year. It was like the 3rd book I read this year. So I started the year off really strong. Every book I read throughout the whole rest of the year was compared to this. So if you don't know, this book follows a woman named Evelyn Hugo who hires this random magazine reporter, or at least it seems very random, to come and interview her to kind of tell her her life story. Because that was one of the big things with Evelyn Hugo, is that she was quite mysterious and she had 7 husbands. So people were curious as to why that was the case. It's really interesting because you get to learn her life story through her kind of telling it, but then you also get flashbacks to the future with the current Evelyn Hugo of today and kind of the like dual timeline sort of thing. And I loved it. I thought it was so interesting. I feel like me describing what happens in this book is pointless because everybody talks about this book. All the discussion on this book is for good reason. It's so good and so interesting, and I like ugly cried through the whole like end of the book. It was very emotional. But like I was saying with Daisy Jones and the Six, I didn't connect with the Daisy Jones characters like I did with these characters. I felt like they were real people. With Daisy Jones, I did feel like they were like a real band that really happened in the 70s, but the characters themselves I didn't necessarily connect to as much as I did with Evelyn and her friends and the husbands that she had. I just feel like they were real people. I feel like Evelyn Hugo, there's like no way that she is a fictional character. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, what is there to say that hasn't been said? I loved this book. I thought it was so well done. I think Taylor Jenkins Reid doing kind of the dual narrative with the historical fiction aspect is like her thing. She's got it down. She's doing well. So if you haven't read this yet, I definitely would recommend. There is a lot of hype and a lot of discussion around it, but I think it's all for good reason because a variety of people are reading this book and loving this book. It's just so good. Like, I feel like I should be able to say more about it, but I feel like I've already talked about it so much on my channel because I read it at the beginning of the year and then started my channel in July. And also, so many other people have talked about this like so much that I feel like I'm just like a broken record. It's probably one of my favorite books I've ever read. Ever. Not just of this year, but ever. So I feel like that's a big statement to make. Definitely would recommend. I love it so much, and it's definitely my favorite book of 2019. So those are all of my favorite books of 2019. I would love to know what your favorite book of 2019 was, or maybe your top 3 if you can't decide, or if you've read any of these books, how you felt about them. Let me know down below. So I think that this might end up being the last video that I post in 2019. So if that is the case, I hope you guys had a great 2019, and I hope 2020 is even better. I hope you guys have a happy new year. But with that being said, that's going to complete this video. So please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe down below if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.